Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. You know, storytelling is something that we talk about a lot on the show. It's been, at least in maybe 3 out of the last 4 shows that we've done. I don't know, perhaps more than that. And the reason we do it is because it's really important. And so many of us who are in content marketing, who are in communications, and actually who are even trying to brand themselves, should really pay more attention to storytelling. And the good news is that my guest today is really going to help us understand some of the key elements that we should keep in mind for our storytelling efforts. He's a video strategist, a media futurist, a TED talker, a communicator. He owns and is the president and CEO of Mad Bear Productions. I hope you are ready to really dig into storytelling with the one, the only, Glenn Zimmerman. Let's get right into it. I am so thrilled to be here with Glenn Zimmerman. We just met, what was it? Very recently in the scheme of things, about 5 or 6 months ago. Is that right, Glenn? We met about...
Yeah, that sounds about right.
In early COVID. I think they were going to have to designate this period as like an epoch in and of itself. We're no longer in BC or CE or AD or anything like that. We're now in DC during COVID, maybe.
Post-COVID, before COVID.
Post-COVID, before COVID. But I hate to call you a COVID friend because that's terrible.
I don't know if I've ever heard that term, but I got to say that there's something to it because I do think that the way that we're developing friendships right now is different.
It's interesting for sure, and it is absolutely because of the lockdown and because of the way that we had to rethink the way that we meet people, the way that we connect with people, that I joined an organization called the Connective, and you joined the Connective through different paths. And that's how we connected, through the Connective. Thanks, Joe Mindek, and the team there. I appreciate that. So Glenn and I are on the Connective, and my listeners might remember I've talked about that a little bit before. We're a group of professionals, really get together every couple of weeks and try to make business referrals and connections for one another. And through that, I've made some really excellent connections. For me, it's mostly people that I just get along with, I find. Mm-hmm. And I'm really happy to say that Glenn is one of the folks who I reached out to early on. I felt like when I saw you introduce yourself on the Connective, Glenn, I was like, okay, yeah, this guy and I, we have this past in common. We have a common thread in our careers. But Glenn has certainly done, more in different ways, and I want to really learn a lot more. So I always thought you were a great target for this, and thanks for joining me.
No, I agree with you. I think that you can look at just marketing itself, and that's a nice connective tissue. But then there's a love for basically an embracing of cultures and the world and the diversity of thought and an inquisitiveness and a curiosity. And so, yeah, back at you, my friend.
Thanks, my man. And look, I feel like since I've started this podcast, Glenn has been one of my ardent supporters. And it's really not only flattering, but it's certainly validating because Glenn is a reporter turned video production agency owner. So we were talking about this before. It's hack to flack, flack to hack. I forget the direction that means.
I think I said before, I'll say again. I think it's either direction would probably be fair, right?
Right. But Glenn was a reporter on ABC News, and where else were you at, Glenn?
So yeah, it depends upon. I was on television for about 15 years. Yeah. I was a reporter at an ABC affiliate when we were in the Detroit market. When I was at NBC in New York was where I finished my career. So yeah, and different sides of journalism. I think the way I used to say it was something around the lines of everything from Man Bites Dog to the investigation of a governor to the crime of du jour to kids going sledding on a day off of school and everything in between.
You ever cover any other hurricanes and weather events and things like that?
Of course.
That guy in the poncho?
Oh, I was that guy. Yeah, I was blasted by the wind, and I got to tell you, there's something to it. I watch it now and I just giggle. And actually, my kids have said this to me. We were watching one day and they're like, "Oh my God, that guy is getting just demolished by the wind. Like, why would he do that?" And all I was thinking was like, "I was that guy. What are you talking about, child?" Right? But the reality is that there's some level of adrenaline that goes into a lot of it.
Yeah.
There's some level of adrenaline that goes into that moment where you feel like you're touching something significant, and let's face it, in some way, I think we all kind of are trying to do that.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I don't know. That was like, you talk to people who are journalists and you talk to people who are doing a lot of live reporting, it becomes kind of like a drug, like that
Yeah.
adrenaline fix. And so, yeah, I loved all that stuff.
I would say that you left it behind and traded that drug for another, maybe, because you founded. I mean, there's been a couple steps in between, and maybe you'll illuminate us. But you're currently the CEO and the founder of Mad Bear Productions. And I will say this: I've seen a lot of Glenn's work. He posts quite often on LinkedIn and other places, but amazing brand storytelling, and particularly in video and in just short killer stories. And I want to get into that in a little bit, but you made that transition from reporter to brand journalist, so to speak. I had a guest recently, Gay Flashman. She wrote a book called Powerful B2B Content. Mm-hmm. She runs a content agency in the UK. And she also was a reporter, TV producer in the UK and Australia before she went on and started her agency. And she talked about brand journalism, and some people call it other things. You know, there's many ways to call it. Corporate newsroom, brand content, storytelling. There's any number of ways, but it's basically taking that journalistic approach and bringing it to a brand. How did you make that transition, and what is it that you like about, or what is it that Mad Bear Productions is aiming for?
So I think that the best way for me to answer it is I think I could certainly give you kind of a linear answer and why. Sure. But what I'd really prefer to do, at least at first, is kind of giving you the deeper idea of the why. When I was at NBC, I saw a seismic shift take place in the way in which news was being developed. Over time, and we've seen it happen now to a much larger extent, but over time, what I saw happening was just this movement toward making news. You know, people use the term sensationalized and stuff, but I think that's a little bit too easily thrown aside. People use the term clickbait, and it's too easily thrown aside. The way I like to refer to it is there's a business of news, and I didn't really think that it was serving the best interest of the public. I didn't really think that it was necessarily targeting the stories that were most important. And I found myself, arguing with my editors sometimes, not necessarily about political direction or anything like that. That never came up. It was more about the story choices themselves and how they were being played. And while that was going on, there was a seismic shift in the way news was done. You know, we actually went through a period of time where the newsroom was not called the newsroom, it was called the content center. And what's happening right now in news in general is, I would like to say it really started then. So while that was all happening, and don't get me wrong, I believe so wholeheartedly in the power of proper journalism and the importance of the media and the questioning of authority figures and the questioning of what we see around us and the search for truth and all of that stuff, right? And, some people might say, oh, right now it's crazy how many different things are going on. And I actually think there's a lot of positives, right? There's a lot of voices that can be shared that in the past we never heard. So it becomes a much more complete story. So this is not about, an attack on news as much as it is a shift in the way the business of news was conducted. And really what I thought was important that I wanted to put my heart and soul into. And at the same time that was happening, I saw that there was a shift in the way that different businesses and different organizations would be able to share their stories. And what I recognized is that historically speaking, the way stories are shared is utilizing certain almost prescribed tactics, media tactics. Fear being one of the prescribed tactics, right? Getting people to do something because you're trying to scare them that if either they don't do it, then something bad's going to happen, or if they do it, then they can avoid something bad from happening, right? So that being kind of like, and I noticed like certain trends in the way that media operated. And I didn't like it. And I thought, well, you know what? What if we use, and maybe it's a little Pollyanna, and maybe it's a little bit like silly of me, but I was like, well, what if we use the connective tissue of story, which is really, you can harken back to the days of like cave drawings, right? The way that people record their humanity. and the way that they connect to other humans, and it spans generations, and it's just kind of who we are. What if we use the connective tissue of story to bring people together rather than to divide, rather than to cause fear, rather than all of these negative emotions? What if we use positive emotions as a way to inspire? And that really is at the forefront of what inspired me to go out. So when you say that, I went and I formed the video agency, I mean, I did. But in my head, I was actually, it might sound silly, but in my head, I was trying to initiate a movement away from the style of storytelling and the way that messaging was going to a different type of messaging.
That's an inspiring message, and it's interesting because it provides a different angle to that transition that I've heard about before. So, when I spoke to Gay a couple weeks ago, like I said, she was talking about, how oftentimes financial drivers are the reason why people leave reporting, why people leave the media and move onto the corporate side. That makes a lot of sense. Money does make the world go round a lot. But to paint journalists with a broad brush, you're generally talking about people who, for the most part, got into this field because of a passion or because of a desire to tell the truth or because of a strict or very honorable code. I'd like to think that that's still true today, too, as well. And when they, by necessity or by desire, decide that they're going to move into the corporate world, suddenly they're oftentimes grappling with changes to that moral code necessarily, or changes to their own value system. It's oftentimes those folks really have to understand what they're getting into and just either not make that move, or they end up unhappy. It doesn't serve anybody's good, But in your case, you seem to be driven by this need or this understanding that the power of story kind of underlies it all. The power of story is what people need.
It's the connective tissue. Yeah, that's the way I see it anyway. I see that it brings, and again, I recognize that the way I see it, it might sound corny when you say it, but I think that sometimes those corny realities are the sort of things that, especially during times of crisis. So, you've had a lot of experience in the Far East, and so you probably know this, but one of my favorite things that I heard many years ago, and for the listeners who have heard it, I apologize, but those who haven't, hopefully you all enjoy this as much as when I first heard it, which was that the Chinese character for the word crisis is actually a combination of two different Chinese characters, danger and opportunity. And I thought, and I still think, that it's so very brilliant. So, are we going through a crisis right now in society? Yes. Have we been building to this crisis? Yes. One of the things, as a marketer and as somebody who's, I think, got my finger on the pulse of media, we've been, and I'm not the first to say it, I'm not going to try to take credit by any stretch, but the reality is that where we are right now has been accelerated by COVID. But all of these trends that we're experiencing were all happening. They've just been accelerated. And so that could be a business conversation, that could be a communications conversation, that could be a relationship conversation. But where I see it is with story, that goes past all of it. And it brings people together. And if you have the possibility to connect people, and by the way, by bringing people together, that doesn't mean that they agree. That doesn't mean that they agree. That doesn't mean that they have the same point of view. It just brings them together in a common basis so that they can understand where the other person's coming from and then react in a coherent, logical, human way versus what's happening right now.
Well, clearly. And, it was something that you said there. It was really interesting, the COVID acceleration. I think that has to be capitalized, capital C, capital A, the COVID acceleration. I hear about that a lot from, marketing experts, from technology experts, from so-called futurists who now are presentists, I suppose, because really things that they have been talking about for years are now reality. And in fact, we've gone beyond them. And we all know the stress on our lives that's happening because part of it is because of maybe a kind of cognitive dissonance between this idea that, we can work and we can interact, but in fact, it's not real interaction. It's a different kind of interaction than we're ready for, than we're kind of accustomed to. The technology has outpaced our expectation for sure. And some of that is amazing, and some of that isn't so amazing. And, everything's accelerated, but I haven't heard of that. Haven't heard the term used necessarily in a more social context. Obviously, we're seeing it around us, but as it applies to the media, as it applies to the idea of storytelling and bringing people together, the concept of acceleration seems really interesting to me. Like, what are the elements of that you're seeing? How are how is that happening in your business and in your approach to storytelling?
So, I'm happy to talk about the stories that we're telling on the business front. I'm happy to talk further about, the transition from being a reporter, which, to say that I was all in is an understatement, right? Like, it was part of my identity. It was my identity. And there was a huge shift, so that for people who are listening, who are going through some sort of a pivot, I'm happy to talk about that too. But I think I think the simple way to make my point, though, is that earlier today, I'm having a Zoom call with, it's actually a potential client, right? Now, I'm friends with one person on the call, and he's introducing me to the final decision maker, and we're on a Zoom, and it's the three of us. And in the middle of the call, the person I'm talking to, who I know, he all of a sudden stops, he looks up, and you can tell he's talking to somebody. And then you hear and you realize that he's having a conversation with his son, and you realize that he's saying, oh, well, we're going to go to the dentist soon. Okay, thanks, bud. See you soon, right? It's those sort of moments that are so human and relatable that, while I'm not trying to suggest it would be better off if the fact that this happened, but I think that the fact that it is happening, I think it's really important for us to pause and identify the human moments in those stories that make it better. Like, I now am feeling closer to him. In some ways we are separate, more separate. In other ways we're together, right? But it's those human moments. And that's my point that I'm trying to get through, that those stories are what make it. And I'm sure all of you have experienced something like that, whether or not, a cat jumps on somebody's lap or a kid jumps into a shot. And there's no way you would ever have had that interaction should it not. And I want to harken back to the fact that that is simply story. That's human to human interaction. That is story. At the core, that is what it is.
Somebody recently described that, not that exact situation, but that whole feeling, this sudden reappearance of human interaction, as kind of the campfire instinct.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot, actually. That's nice.
I'm extrapolating a little bit from what he said. Steve Brown, I believe, who I interviewed a couple of months ago. And Steve talks about storytelling in the context of, how he's helping clients and, turning the client into not the hero, but into the guide. So that the ultimate customer is the hero. Mm-hmm. That's, an approach that seems to be growing and growing now. But anyway, his point was that the reason storytelling is so powerful is because fundamentally in our DNA, we have this urge as humans, as Homo sapiens, to gather around the fire, protect each other, and communicate what's happening in our lives or in the world around us, whether that be danger's coming, or the weather's going to be X, or, the shaman tells us that it's going to be a bountiful harvest. Whatever the heck it is, we're around the campfire. That's when we feel the most connected and the most safe. Mm-hmm. So the real storytelling, powerful storytelling, elicits exactly that feeling. And I never thought of it that way before, but what you're saying now, it's going to make me look at Zoom calls differently, or any video call, because now, obviously, I have people on my teams who are parents, who are caring for people, who have lives and who've been thrown into a tizzy because of this whole thing. And we're now 6 months or so in, and people are, for the most part, they say they've gotten used to it. I don't know if that's true, but at least it's very common to see, like you said, kids jumping in, or somebody putting their hand over the camera, or turning off the camera and saying, "Hey, just hang on just a second," and dealing with another family issue. Life,
right? I mean, my son, up until this call, I didn't realize it. He was practicing his trombone. And I actually thought to myself about knocking on his door and going, "Hey, bud, just a little heads up, I'm about to record a podcast, yada, yada, yada." And I'm like, no, that's part of the story. I want to hear it. If that's what he's doing, then fine. There'll be a trombone playing. I was going to intentionally not say something for a period of time and wait until it came up, so that way the listeners would go, "Wait a minute, what am I hearing in the background?" Because like a muffled trombone has a very, very distinct sound, right? But but that's story. Right? And so taking this concept and transitioning it directly into a business conversation, one of the things that I notice oftentimes is whenever there's any sort of meeting, be it a virtual event, or be it a one-on-one meeting, or be it like a convention, right? Mm-hmm. The first thing you hear people saying is it's this apologetic sort of approach. Oh, we really wish we could be in person. We can't do it this year. It's really a bummer. We're going to have to do it in the future. But, for now, this is the best we got.
Every time,
right? And, Yeah, duh, of course we want to be together. Of course it would be, we don't need to say that again. We don't need to be apologetic. And more so than that, there's aspects of what we're doing right now that we would never be able to do if we were in person. I would never have had that interaction with my friend. If my son was playing trombone, you wouldn't know about it, right?
I would never be doing this.
We would never be.
No. Well, I don't want to say that, but I certainly would not. I'd accelerated my timeline for sure. But yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So when you're approaching an event or when you're approaching any communication, rather than apologizing for the fact that you have to communicate in this forum, think through what can you do with this forum that enhances your connection to the person, right? Be it a large event or be it something as simple as a Zoom call, right? I've been actually, and it's very different, but we're not showing video, but where I am right now, we have it, I was telling you, Dan, we had a little problem where our AC was leaking, right? And caused some damage to our house. So I am now sitting here doing this at a rental property. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, Dan and I actually can see each other as we talk. It just makes the human interaction a little bit better. So behind me, there is a dream catcher, right? And it's so present in my shot that I can't help but tell people that it's not my dream catcher because it looks like I've positioned this shot so that it's mine. But now we're talking and we're connecting as humans, and now it's a memorable sort of moment, right?
Yeah, it's a great conversation piece. I mean, when we logged on, I thought, wow, Glenn's into wolves. Right? Because there's wolves on there. It is a lovely dream catcher.
Sure. It's not mine, but it's lovely.
Not maybe for somebody else, but it's certainly is a lovely piece. And yeah, it's those kinds of things, right? It's those kinds of
story,
little
though, Dan. That's the story stuff. And I think that we're so busy and we're so focused on what we're doing that I don't think we pause and recognize the value of it. And to me, those little moments are the most valuable. You think about the things that, if you have kids or whoever's listening, think about the things that are most memorable about your childhood. They are never the big things. They are always the little nuances, the sitting on the stoop of wherever you lived with an ice cream cone and your dad, or it's this minor little things of life. And that's what I'm trying to get across. And that's really what we're experiencing. And I think we have to embrace it because that's the power of story.
People are certainly more open to it because it happens all the time on a daily basis. You're more open to these little things, just like you said. It's something that you definitely embrace, and it's part of the story. It becomes part of the story. I love it. I love this realism, this authentic realism.
Authenticity. That's the term. Like you were talking about before, what has been like these shifts. That's the big shift too. It's this shift toward more than ever. We want authenticity. I think we do. I think that is a. Go ahead. You were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask you on that exact topic. We mentioned authenticity, but is that the core element to what makes a good story? I mean, we've been talking about stories and about the human touch, but if you could boil it down to like a secret sauce, what are the things that make a good story now?
That's a really great question. I don't know if I've ever really thought about it in that way. I think authenticity in this era is essential because we become so unbelievably oversaturated with media that everybody is an incredible media critic, whether or not you realize it or not. I mean, and one of the first things that we can smell is if somebody's bullshitting us or if it's real, like immediately, right? And if somebody's bullshitting us, click onto the next thing, right? Like all the time. Like we're very astute to that. So that notion of authenticity, it's almost a filter that you got to pass through in order to actually allow me to take my time and spend it with you.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm just thinking out loud as you're asking a very good question. So I think authenticity is an important thing. I've always felt character development is the most important part really of any story. So, authenticity is at the peak of it, right? But who the characters are and the richness. And they could be characters you love or they can be characters you hate. It's kind of just like the range of emotions. Sometimes when we're building stories, I have to talk to clients about this or anybody about it if I'm speaking, that making an emotional connection to a story is not necessarily like, oh my gosh, I'm sad, you've made me cry. Or, yay, I'm happy. It's not as simple as that. Like, think about the complexity of all the range of emotions that you as a human feel. That's what an emotional connection is. You're touching real human emotions. And sometimes it's a menagerie of emotions that hits you at various times or sometimes all at once. So I think that character development, connecting into an emotional relevance, is important. And then when it comes to a business, I think that what you were talking about is extremely essential right now. I use slightly different terms than what you were saying, but I think it's the same thing, which is that I encourage everybody that we work with to lead by being helpful. You start off by being helpful. To me, that is modern marketing at its best. You're being helpful. You're showing that you're being helpful. You're reinforcing that you're being helpful. You're not asking for anything. You're just being helpful. And in the process of that, you're also showcasing your expertise. You're showcasing how good you are at what you're doing. And there's a little bit of a social statement, like I'm believable, I'm good, I'm trustworthy. I'm not here just to basically, sell you something, I believe in this. There's something behind it. There's an authentic passion behind it and why I do it, and here it is. And I'm willing to share some of that with you without you giving me any money.
Yeah, and that's the whole concept of the guide, of the kind guide, and like if you're thinking about the classic hero's journey, the hero needs a guide at some point, and if your customer is the hero, and if you're a B2B company or any company really, B2B or B2C, but if you are one of your clients, for example, your client is the hero to you, but the story that you have to build for your client has to position the client's client as the hero.
Very true.
It's it's very cool actually the way you have to keep those trains going at the same time as you work with people on storytelling. But it seems to me that more and more people, certainly more and more brands that are smart, are getting into this whole idea that, we have to just put the customer in charge, but we have to be able to help and guide and steer and offer them the right kind of advice and the right kind of information along the way so that they trust us, so that we're first doing no harm. And as long as what we're doing is legit and is authentic, of course,
correct.
That has to be the baseline, it seems. Yeah. Sorry.
I was actually going to ask you a question because you've been on the flip side, given other aspects of your career, where you're telling stories that you're very close to because it's the brand story that you're a part of, and you're bringing in vendors or agencies to help you tell the story.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question, right? Like, because I see it at this stage purely from my role as helping to guide the client, but on your end, you're being guided.
Sometimes.
Oh, that's a good point.
We're being guided.
That's a good point. So walk me through that. That's interesting.
Sometimes we are being guided in that we are working with excellent people for whom storytelling is in their blood. I did mention Gay Flashman before, full disclosure. We are one of her clients. I think I said that on the podcast before. But people like her and like some other agencies we're working with, they understand our business. So the first thing is to really gain an understanding of the things that we do and the things that we're trying to do. So the vision, the corporate vision, not what we want to market, but what the actual societal purpose, and in some ways, what the vision of our company is, where we're going, what is it that we actually want to achieve with the products that we sell. Years ago, it would have been, we have a better widget than that company, and that's why we're selling, right? I mean, in fact, I think a lot of, and I work for a Japanese company, people know this, a lot of Japanese companies still actually take that approach. We have a better widget, people will buy it. In point of fact, the widget itself is not the story. The story is what the customer can do with that widget and why it's important. So in one case, for example, it could be a energy solution. And what's more important these days than reducing a carbon footprint or than taking down to carbon zero even? How can we make that happen for our clients? So the storytelling people that we work with, our agencies, understand this, that it's not about the widget that gets you to carbon zero, it's about carbon zero. And then backing into how that widget plays a role in that story. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but they work with us, they understand the business to that degree, and then find the human stories within the company that then translate into, a story that we can tell outwardly.
Yeah, it's. I think what's interesting is depending upon the corporate culture you're dealing with, you're going to get a wide range of different approaches here. In some cases, the corporate culture is frankly very overbearing, and there's certain corporate speaks, and I've tried to fight the fight against corporate speak because that's a story killer, right? That's immediately once you start using corporate speak, it's obvious and it blows it out. Other companies are much more open and are much more flexible to think through that, like when we first started, the story that I used to like to tell, and again, it's a very simple story. I would be sitting at a restaurant, and somebody would say, "What do you do?" And I would say, "Well, we tell stories." And they would say, "What do you mean?" And I would pick up a fork that's in front of me, and I would say, "Okay, let's take this fork, for example. Where was the ore mined? What type of ore is it? The person who discovered that type of ore, what happened there? The color, what happened to create this color? Under the earth, when everything formed together, is there a story to be told with the metals coming together, right? The transportation of it, interesting. What companies were involved, what people were involved, how was it formed? Was it originally designed for this particular fork? Is that what it was for? The design of the fork, where did that come from? What's the inspiration? What is the company trying to say, the restaurant trying to say by using this design as the way that they are using it? Here we are at a restaurant. It's a public place. Many people have used the fork. In the fork's presence, what has happened, right? Has a celebrity ever used the fork? Like, these are all stories about a fork that humanizes the fork. But it's really not about the fork, is it?
No, it's like the storytelling is answering the questions that the people don't know that they want to ask.
But that really matter. Those are all the things that really matter, right? It's that whole question of like the Simon Sinek, the why, like that's what's the most important component of everything. And that's just a simple way of getting at it.
Yeah, and you're totally right about corporate culture, because my listeners will know, and my colleagues and friends also understand that when you work within a corporate culture that is based in a completely different culture, with a big C, with a capital C, like I work for a Japanese company, there are other considerations to storytelling that aren't always apparent.
It's fascinating.
And it's just fascinating. Now, there's always good stories to tell, always. And everybody has, a variation of essentially a similar approach, I think. There's a journey that you tell, and somebody's the hero, somebody's not. And, you ultimately get to a place where the brand becomes either the hero or the helper of the hero, and where everybody's in a better place. Way oversimplifying, but that's generally like the arc. In the case of, though, like some cultures, right, where you have such a deep pride and a almost inculcated deep respect for the thing that you're making, right? If you work for a company for 10, 20, 30 years that makes something and just takes ultra pride in making that something, the people inside the company, their view is that they don't matter. It's the something that matters.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sometimes. One big eye-opener we had, for example, is we make one of the things that my company makes is big industrial compressors. And a big industrial compressor has a lot of moving parts. We're here in 2020. I mean, this was a few years ago, but we're still like way into the 20 teens. Modern technology abounds around us. There's AI happening, and there's AI that's helping to, really understand measurements of metallurgical measurements down to the millimeter and so on. There's some, or even the micrometer. And I'm not doing it justice by even saying that. But you have this environment, then out comes this guy wearing what would essentially be a set of coveralls, right? But Japanese style. It's like basically a uniform, name tag. He looks like a maintenance worker. He comes out in the middle of this very, high-tech environment. He's got an old-fashioned tool belt, and he's got a ball-peen hammer, and some other small tools. And he sets himself down behind this giant rotor, right? And he proceeds with one hand and with the hammer to start to hammer in the rivets around the rotor. Now, these rivets, they look like bolts, right? And you would just assume that there's some machine that goes and puts them in there properly. And there's thousands of machines that do this, that do it to the micrometer. This guy, and maybe, I think the number is 8 people on Earth, do this exact task, which is, it's called peening by hand. You take those rivets and he just basically hammers them so that they kind of, it's like adding a bevel to the sides of them. I can't even explain. But one of our storytelling people, one of my colleagues was in the shop when this guy was out there, and she had the sense to say, take a video of this man right now.
As you were talking, I was like, this is the greatest story that you could say about your brand.
It's a beautiful story.
Beautiful.
And what you end up with is this gentleman, this man who's an artisan. And
pride.
And the visuals are amazing. And the slow-mo of him hammering this thing, it's a gorgeous story, and I still love it. It's probably the best single storytelling video that I've ever had the pleasure to do or to see. And those are the kinds of things that are there to be uncovered. The point I was trying to make, though, ultimately was the culture that's within is like, okay, but the artisan himself, he is secondary to the company. He is just somebody who works for us. It's really, the rotor. So that perspective is, in the modern sense, kind of an enemy of storytelling.
I don't agree. I don't agree actually with that. I think that what you're highlighting is that your audience shapes the story, right? Like it's the old expression of like, know your audience. But I think in this day and age, with how incredibly niche different audiences are and how you can hyper target different audiences, I think that it's never more true than that. And if you are talking to an audience that sees things the way you just described it, then you shape the story differently. I was just literally just literally having a conversation with somebody about this, that, they were initiating a fundraising campaign, just the call before this. They were initiating a fundraising campaign. They were having a hard time figuring out the best way to fundraise in this environment. I won't mention the brand involved, but, really well-known national brand. And what I suggested was find out who because they're hand delivering the messages. This is not going to be like a social media blitz, or these are insiders who know these different people who could potentially invest. But the people who are hand delivering the message are not necessarily professional, nonprofit fundraisers, right? So the video or the story would have to engage them in a new way. So I said, why not just basically make these videos, figure out the 3, 4, 5 different types of audiences you're working with and design the videos specifically for those audiences so that the person feels like, oh, I'm corporate America and I want X, Y, and Z out of it. Great. Oh, I'm, a do-gooder who wants to change the world. Great. Like whatever it is, as long as it's authentic to the brand. So to your point, we worked with a Hong Kong-based company that did a lot of business in China. But it was fascinating because everything, like all of my instincts about what would resonate with an audience, it ended up being the exact opposite would resonate with that audience. It was literally like bizarro world terms from a marketing standpoint. So I imagine from your standpoint, you experience those sort of cultural differences. And as long as you understand them and they are embedded in the way that you storytell.
Right.
That's crucial.
And now that you've illustrated that way, yes, I'll clarify what I said earlier, where the idea that the machine is the center and not the man is the enemy of storytelling. It was the enemy of storytelling for a particular audience that we were thinking about.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are absolutely people out there, and certainly our executives, for example, would, I'm sure, love to see more about the machine and the great things that we're making, And that sort of brings up another question I had about what we do, about storytelling in general. And I've had a hard time, and I know that other people who consider storytelling as part of their toolkit have had a hard time when they talk to executives and they talk to people within the company about, hey, let's take a storytelling approach. The executives suddenly, they go to Aesop or something, they think fables, which, by the way, is a great model for storytelling.
Sure.
But at that point in time, we want to say, no, we're not talking about animals. Maybe we could, maybe we should. But what we are, they go to fairy tales, for example. And it's like, no. Storytelling is not that. Well, then what is it? So we've taken, instead of calling it storytelling, we've taken to avoiding that term, right? And just calling it, we're going to write some articles, we're going to do a video, just go with it that way, and sort of, instead of giving it an overarching theme. But among ourselves, we call it storytelling. Why do you think executives, not all clearly, but why do you think a lot of executives have this kind of resistance and automatically think that storytelling is fluff?
Because I don't think it sounds like it's results oriented.
Yeah.
And like, that's something that I've also learned early on too, that my heart is in the notion of story. Like, that's really where I want to go. And the truth is, most people want to go to story. Whenever we get a call about a video, people will call, like, example, right? We need a website video. We want, this is what we need, right? Or we want a website video or whatever, right? And my first thought is, well, I don't know if you really want a website video. I don't know if you really need a website video. You want a particular result, and you believe that the website video is going to help you achieve that result, right? And I don't want to sound like I'm being a wise ass. Like, that's not the way I'm intending to come across.
That's a very common conversation.
It's extremely common, which is the reality that they come out with, they want something, but what's more important is that what does the something create? So back to your question around storytelling, the storytelling in a business sense, in a marketing framework, it still has to achieve something. And to me, that's the beginning of the conversation. So to walk you through our process, and I'm not sure that it's all that unique, but this is our process. We always start with, what is the result? And the way I like to word it is, I say, okay, let's say we finish this project. And at this point, they can think the project is whatever they want to think it is, because I don't know what it is yet, right? Let's say we finish this project, and at the end of this project, you were like, oh my gosh, like, you literally want to, like, fly to wherever I am and hug me. You'd wear a mask obviously now, but you'd hug me, right? And oh my God, and celebrate because of how amazing this just went. So what happened? What just happened that was so amazing? What, change in your business? What needle has been moved, right? Let's really drill that down, understand what it is. Okay, so what audiences exist out there that could move that needle, that hit that exact button? Let's identify them. Okay, interesting. All right, cool. And where are they, right? Are we going to find them at a trade show floor? Are we going to find them, watching television? Are we going to find them on the side, walking down the street, and it's a large digital billboard, and it's the side of a building? Are we going to find them on social media? Is it an email? Like, whatever,
Where
right?
do they live?
Wherever they are, where are they? Because the way that the story is told has to change based upon the way that the person's going to receive it in the platform, right? So it's always in that order. And then at that point, we're like, okay, given the result, number one, next, the audience, and then next, where we're delivering that audience, the channel, how do we tell the story? What stories can activate that goal? Because everything has to funnel into that result. Otherwise, there's no purpose. I think a really good example of good storytelling, and, I can't take any personal credit for it, but like Yeti is doing some really nice stuff right now, right? Yeah. It's brand storytelling, and it's this idea of, it's not about Yeti. It's not about, okay, yeah, we make these really expensive, awesome coolers. It's not that. It's that the things that the people who buy these awesome coolers do, and the cooler's along for the ride. And there's a little moment within each video where you can see the cooler in the back of a pickup truck or wherever it is, but it stands for something larger, and there's a real human connection to the greater story, and it might be inspirational, it might be educational, who knows?
I really wish sometimes that I was an outdoor lifestyle brand, because
they seem
they seem to have an easy time of it. The North Face did an amazing job with this.
Yeah.
There's this video, I forget, like it's a couple years old already, but it's like a full 2-3 minutes of people just having a hell of a time out there, just hurting themselves and bleeding and having a tough time and getting beaten by the elements. And then in the end, they're just like, and it's just like they're wearing a North Face thing, or there's a sleeping bag that's a North Face sleeping bag. Like, how beautiful is that? And of course, the narration, I don't remember every detail of it. I just remember that the North Face is not the hero. The hero are these heroes, these legit people who are doing amazing things. But, if you're a soap brand, you could do a lot. Believe me, you could do a lot as a soap brand. But you're not going to get those vistas and those kind of, bloody, struggling people necessarily. Although I will say soap has done an amazing job with storytelling, like Dove.
Dove
Original Beauty and so on.
It's beautiful.
It is
Smart.
It's a beautiful way to do it.
But you can get into the core of that in many different ways, and that's the part. Like again, I can't take credit. One of our clients is Valspar paint company.
Oh yeah, that was a great video you guys have done. Yeah,
It's very kind.
I saw that
and
great work.
Thank you. It was very kind. And that's something we did recently, but there's something that they did before we started working with them. And the guys who's one of their marketing heads, he was the one who came up with the idea. And I wish that I was working with them then because it's such a brilliant idea. So they are a paint company, right? So they pride themselves on centering around the notion of color, that color matters, that color impacts, color has emotional impacts. It has all sorts of impacts in our lives that are subtle but important, right? Very, very cool, very relatable. So they framed the whole thing around, there was a new technology that had come out that would allow somebody who had a certain type of blindness to see color for the very first time.
Those glasses?
And but the person had never seen color before. And so if, the notion of the whole project was, if you want to know what the power of color is, watch this.
Yeah.
And it was not even about Valspar. It was about something very human. It was like, and it doesn't have to be about color. We've all had firsts in our lives, right? It doesn't matter what that first is. It's tying into a very human reaction to something that's very primal. Yeah. And all brands have that. Makes no difference what it is. And I think that the ones that are lifestyle brands, it's almost too easy.
Yeah.
It's almost too easy. And as a result, don't get me wrong, they can do some memorable storytelling, but I don't know if that encourages you to go and necessarily buy more North Face. Right? I think the ones that really are magnificent are, like you were saying, like the Dove brands, that suddenly their storytelling says something about who they are and what they stand for or what they believe in, and you align with that in some form.
Yeah.
And that's
deeper.
And that's the stuff that's much deeper, but it's because, it's not necessarily an adrenaline-fueled moment.
It's subtle,
Yeah.
The subtlety wins you over time and might even stick a little bit longer for a lot of people. I guess, all these stories are hitting you on an emotional level, that's for sure. Just which emotion is triggered sometimes creates a stronger bond with the brand. And that is always going to be true of different products for different people. There are folks out there who absolutely love North Face. There's folks out there who love cars. There are people who love steel manufacturing facilities. Whatever
Right.
it is, there's something. There are people to bond with that particular story.
Well said. I totally agree. I just had a really personal experience that I think is relevant, and didn't occur to me to say something until you just mentioned that. But my son was just had his bar mitzvah.
Oh, mazel tov.
Thank you. On Saturday, actually. So, and of course, in the world of COVID, how do you do it?
Yeah.
So it became like a challenge, like everything else. But circling back to the notion of story, we decided that we were going to do a virtual event. And he didn't want to put it off. He was like, no, I studied for this moment. I want to do it now. So, okay, we're going to make this special. And so the whole event was extremely personal. Like I focused much more on like going through images, and I spent so much time like looking through old images and figuring out what stories can be told from the different images. And, I was telling stories in the virtual, in the virtual session on multiple levels. Like I kind of Bugs Bunny'd it where it's on two different levels, right?
Yeah.
Like where like on one level, everybody would connect with that moment with their child or that moment with whatever. But the other level, which most people didn't know, is that every single thing that I selected had a secondary meaning to him.
Oh, so it was really for your son.
It was for him that everybody else could also enjoy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I am a passionate person. I am like a love life, embrace life sort of person, but I'm not like an emotional person. But this whole process was extremely emotional.
Yeah,
going through all of that. I've never had an emotional, I shouldn't say never, very, very rarely had an emotional reaction to something like that. But it was really because I was reliving the stories in my head with my son. And now I'm sharing them with him and I'm sharing them with others. And then we can all share in it together. And
well, now you've got a whole third level to that story, which is the father-son tale.
It was beautiful.
That you've just kind of laid on top of that. How does it get any better than that?
Oh, it's beautiful, man. Honestly, it was really, I had no idea. I had no idea that it was going to impact me that strongly. Like rite of passage stuff. It was amazing.
It's a killer story for so many reasons. It hits me a little bit because my dad passed away just before my bar mitzvah, like several months before my bar mitzvah. Yeah. And my listeners, I've never talked about this before on my podcast, but my bar mitzvah was around this time of year. Actually, we might have had the same portion. I did Bereshit, the very first.
That's exactly what he did.
There you go. So we're bar mitzvah buddies, you, me, and your son.
No way.
It's very significant
cool.
for my listeners who are not Jewish. That's the very first line of the Torah of the Bible, right? Is and we don't go down the religion road necessarily here, but the experience, the rite of passage, the familial connection, the story that you tell, the pride of going through this whole thing, and for me, bonding with with my rabbi and with a whole slew of cast of characters. I was looking at the album from that event not too long ago. I was at my mom's and going through old stuff.
Interesting.
But yeah, so you're right, man. It's just, and there it is. Like the power of that story just triggered this whole kind of flood in my head. And if brands can do that, not to kind of, I don't want to kill that wonderful story that you just told, but if we steer it back to the brands and we steer it back to, how businesses and how not even businesses, how people, personal brands, anybody can really harness the power of storytelling. That's a great example. Just what is it that matters?
And it's not, to me, you're not reducing story down to anything other than what it is. I think what you're doing is you're exploring story. And honestly, I want more brands to embrace story for what it is. I want it. I think, frankly, again, to sound a little bit Pollyanna, I think that the world becomes a better place if that's the way we're communicating as humans, rather than the way we are communicating right now, right? And, just as a simple example, back to my son's story. So because other people, so in this case, I shared it with, not the world, but a group of people. And then what was fascinating, and my wife was actually really blown away by this, was that as people would hear about this who didn't know, because the rite of passage, and this is not a Jewish thing, everyone has rites of passage, everyone has stories, and that's my point. The rite of passage was so important. My neighbor comes over and he's like, what are you doing, right? And we're friends, but we're not like tight. Like I'm not going to invite him to my son's bar mitzvah. That's just not necessarily what I was going to do, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, hey, what's going on? And I know he's Jewish, and I told him. We talked for about 15 minutes. He was so touched by the whole thing. He goes home, comes back like a half hour later, and gives my son $100 as a birthday, as a bar mitzvah gift. And I'm like,
wow.
I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, and it's not the $100. And first of all, the other part is like, he just happened to have a bar mitzvah card lying around. Like, I didn't understand that, but like, and it was perfect. It was like bar mitzvah, it was everything. But like, but still, the reality was that that's what he did. So something about it touched something in him as a human, right? Triggered a memory for him, like with you, whatever.
Yeah.
And boom, this is what he felt compelled to do. That's amazing to me. And I think that's worth highlighting. And as we as humans communicate, be it brand communication, be it personal communication, I think, I'm sorry, but I think the world's a better place if we communicate like that.
I agree with you. And it helps me to understand, that storytelling almost as a discipline.
That's interesting.
That it's growing, that it's a real thing. It's not just a couple of marketers getting in a room saying, okay,
No, it's not a tactic. It's not a tactic. No, it's not a tactic.
Oh, it's almost a martial art in some ways. It's a way. There's a Japanese character, for the way, and the Japanese character, the sound is do. So whenever you hear like aikido, bushido, that means the way, right?
In contrast to the jitsu. Right?
Jitsu is the art, the technique and the art.
It's more the technique. I've always heard it like when you're talking like Aikido versus Aikijitsu or Judo versus Jujitsu.
Yep.
Like the difference has always been like the Do is the way and the Jitsu is it's the military component of it. So
exactly.
It's like while with the Do you would stop, with the Jitsu you would go for the break.
Perhaps. Yes, exactly. The Do is the sport form. Like in reality, so like kendo is like you put on these armor and you use bamboo and you hit the hell out of each other with a sword, right? According to a specific art. But kenjutsu is like the art of the sword, the technique of the sword, and that's where you take that katana and you just slice somebody to shreds. Yep. So that the whole thing is that that way. I think it should be called maybe storytelling do or something. Like maybe there's there's a
That's a
book
website
or
that you're going to
something
buy in
website
about
in there. I don't
15
know.
minutes, I imagine.
I'm telling you, nobody would. It's another.
By the time you put this out there, it's already gone. Storytelling dough.
I wanted to go back to something we had talked about. It might have been when we talked a couple weeks ago, and the work that you're doing, thinking about the effect of the media on on all of us today. And I think you have a unique insight into the way things are these days. So we don't get into politics on the show, but there's definitely a connection that we should talk about, like what the media is doing and what that means for us as storytellers and as and brands and corporations. Like, what is it about that whole thing that we should get to?
I think that at least what I feel from what you're saying is it's not about politics at all. I think that the media has become such a large entity that it is influencing our thoughts and our feelings. And we are at the point right now where we don't even realize what's happening. We don't realize how we're being influenced. And it makes no difference what your political beliefs are, your religious beliefs, your cultural beliefs. The point is, it's literally like there's something in the air, you're breathing it, and it's affecting your body in some way, and you don't know. Because we become, at this point, oblivious to the fact that it's even happening, because it's been happening so long and so pervasively.
Absolutely. And I know that you're working on some very interesting projects in that area. So when you're ready to talk about that, we'll bring you back on. And we'll dig in a little bit. But I think this conversation we've just had, I think this deep dive into storytelling has been a real fascinating. It's been rewarding for me, and I think that there's quite a few takeaways for our listeners here. We talk about it sometimes. I've referred to the story brand, which is Donald Miller's methodology. I've referred to Park Howell's method, which is ABT, and but therefore framework, and among other things. He's just written a book called Brand Bewitchery, which is delightful. And now I've got a real practitioner who really is just sort of where the rubber hits the road in a lot of ways with Glenn to talk about this. I don't think this is a topic that that is going anywhere anytime soon. And in fact, with the way the technology is evolving and the way that brands are changing, the way that they acknowledge their values or don't, is also changing the way that we tell stories in some ways, or changing the way that corporations want to tell stories, maybe. Because I think one thing that we discovered is that storytelling is actually built into who we are. It's fundamental. So maybe the storytelling itself isn't necessarily changing so much. It's more a matter of discovering what needs to fit into the storytelling realm.
Yeah, the way I like to look at it is that storytelling is the same. It's the tools that we are using have changed and have evolved. And as a result, in order for it to tell the right stories, like, do I have a moment just to give a quick example?
Sure,
I don't.
Of course.
So we were producing some content fairly recently that was virtual reality content. So we were using a virtual reality camera. And the idea of this particular shoot was we wanted to do a slow movement into the lobby of a museum. So you would feel like you're entering this museum, right? Now, when it comes to virtual reality, you can't move too fast, because if you move fast and there's no point of reference, you get sick.
Yes.
So, but what you can do is if you move very slowly and deliberately, it's okay. You don't have that feeling of nausea, and it's all right. So, okay, we solve for that. That's fine. But here's the interesting part of it. Like, how do you tell stories in this environment when the camera sees everything? Because normally speaking, you would take the camera, right, if it was a regular camera, and we would put it on a dolly, and we would have the videographer behind the dolly and push the camera, and no big deal, right? Fine. But when you have everything in the purview, the videographer would be in the shot. You would see him literally pushing the dolly and the camera, right? So how do you change things? And so the reality was, when we first started doing this, and this actually was, it's about 5 years ago now that we first started doing it, we realized that we came across these realities in storytelling as we were doing it. So we ended up getting some fishing line, okay, tying it to the base of the dolly, And then my videographer, and it sounds super like MacGyver rudimentary, but we're in a situation where we're like, wow, we never really thought about this, because it's taking a new tool and adding it into a storytelling sector. But how do we tell the story effectively? You know? And so he hid behind like a wall, and we wound it around like a railing, and then he slowly reeled it in. You know?
Amazing.
So the point that I'm getting at is that that's the tactical part of storytelling, but it shows an example of how the same emotions still need to be drawn from it. You want to feel like you're entering a room. You want to feel like you're experiencing something new. You want to have the exploration, the ability to explore. That's the beauty of virtual reality. But then, because the tool is different, you have to approach it differently. So, no, that's...
It does create different challenges.
It creates different challenges, but to your point, the philosophy of storytelling remains the same. It's just how you utilize the tool. I mean, and it was a branded story, and it was basically a tourism video that we were showcasing different sections of museums, and right. I think we were one of the first people to actually. I mean, I mentioned a second ago that we shouldn't put a VR camera on things moving, but we strapped it on a roller coaster, and it was intense.
Awesome.
It was intense. I mean, honestly, I can only watch in full 360, like with a VR and like 3D. I can only watch a couple seconds of that, but.
Oh man.
But the non-VR version, just the 360 version that you could watch on your phone, it's so cool.
I'm about to upgrade my phone to the iPhone 12 Pro. It's coming.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Just got news that it's delayed, of course. But, you know, my wife will be getting hers on time. Mine is delayed because I chose the wrong color.
What color did you choose?
Blue one. You know, it's been a while. I'm on the 10, the original X. So it's been like almost 3 years. So it's been several generations, and I figure, okay, time to do it. I'm excited about it because it's got that, you know, it's got a little bit more, you know, a little more gear. You know, let's face it, it's going to be a lot of fun to use.
Absolutely.
But you know, the point is that you know, the technology's getting there, that we could take advantage of these and understand, you know, VR, AR, all of those really cool platforms even more and more as we go. And I'm looking forward to see the way that develops. But Glenn, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. If people want to find you, they go to Mad Bear Productions.
Yes, with an S, but madbearproductions.com.
Madbearproductions.com. And of course, you can look for Glenn Zimmerman on LinkedIn. And if you need to know how to spell his name, just look in the episode title. And other than that, is there anything else people need to, where people can find you? Is there anything on the horizon?
I'm definitely open to whatever people want to reach out and talk about. Like
Fantastic.
the idea of connectivity is very significant to me. So if you have a question, then reach out.
Terrific. And I recommend everybody does, because Glenn is a great guy to know. And certainly check out Mad Bear Productions, the video, the storytelling. I'm telling you, money where his mouth is. Glenn is not bullshitting.
Very kind.
Videos are amazing. That Valspar thing really got me. I love that with the kid. I mean,
it's really kind.
I'm not going to say anything more about it. Just there's a kid.
It's very kind.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this episode of The Dan Nessel Show, please head on over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the podcast player of your choice to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And please don't forget to spread the word. Thanks for listening.